justice to be handed down in Israel? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on walking through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Exodus 23. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 9. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus 23, beginning at verse 1. You shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Also, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Chapter 23 continues with the judgments of God that we've been looking at in chapters 21 and 22. These judgments would become part of the Book of the Covenant, and thus be part of the law of Moses. We are not under this law today, for one, because this law was given to Israel alone and not to the Gentiles, but more importantly, Colossians 2:14 says that Christ nailed this law to his cross in order to usher in the law of Christ. However, it is still good to study this law in order to know how God dealt with his people of old and how he expects us to be obedient to the law he has given us. This section of chapter 23 concerns justice. The first thing talked about is slander, or the spreading of rumors. Some rumors may be right, but many are wrong, or at the very least embellishments of the truth. The Israelites were not to be gossips, and the New Testament would teach us that as well. Gossip has the ability to ruin someone's reputation without them getting the chance to defend themselves. It's one thing to report what we've seen to the proper authorities, but we're not to go around spreading rumors. Moving on, God talks about following the wicked in their evil deeds. They were not to participate in the evil of others, nor were they to follow the crowd in doing evil, or testify in a dispute that would pervert justice. These judgments remind me of the trial of Jesus that we discussed in Matthew 26, lesson 135 of that series. If you recall, not only was the trial an evil one, but false witnesses were called to testify against Jesus. The Pharisees stirred up a mob to get Pilate to crucify Jesus in Matthew 27. Thus, the people of that day broke all three of these judgments of God. God gave these judgments so that the righteous wouldn't be condemned, as it is obvious that if they are not heeded, the likelihood that the righteous would be condemned is much greater. Verse 3 of Exodus 23 goes on to say that they were not to show partiality with a poor man in his dispute. Often in our justice system, we think that partiality is shown to the rich, but it can also be shown to the poor. Someone is not evil just because they're rich, and someone is not righteous just because they're poor. Therefore, they were not to favor a poor man based on his lack of wealth, assuming that he was always telling the truth. They were to weigh the evidence fairly and come to a righteous judgment. Verses 4 and 5 deals with justice for our enemies. When an enemy does something bad to us, we often want to see something bad happen to them, even if we don't do it ourselves. The Hindus call this karma. Most others call it getting what you deserve. We should never be wishing ill on anybody, including our enemies. If they saw their enemy's donkey or any animal going off, getting lost, they weren't to let it wander off. They were to return it. If they saw their enemy's donkey stuck under a burden in a helpless position, they weren't to leave the animal there to get killed or die. They were to help it. Jesus taught in Matthew 5:43-48 that we're to love our enemies. In part, he was drawing on God's judgments here for Israel. Why should we do this? For one, God said so. 2, it's the right thing to do. And 3, because who knows, maybe this act of kindness will turn our enemy into our friend. We should want as few enemies as possible, so doing good to others should help us in this regard. Verses 6 to 9 goes back to dealing with justice for the poor. Just as in verse 3, we find that they were not to show partiality for the poor, they also weren't to swing the other way and not regard the poor at all. The whole idea is that justice is blind and was to be handed out fairly. That's why they were not to inflict capital punishment on one whose guilt had not been clearly proven, and why they were not to accept bribes. Such pervert justice and ruins the confidence of the people in the system of justice. God's judges were to act righteously in all things, or they would be judged by God for their evil. And finally, they were to even hand out proper justice upon the stranger. They were not to oppress the stranger, for they were strangers in Egypt, and so should know what it was like to be treated unfairly. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus 23, verses 10 to 13, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.